Welcome to Beyond the Breakwater, where just beyond the crashing waves of fear, discomfort, and doubt lies the greatest potential for life transformation. We want to guide you into the open waters where the calculated risk you take becomes the turning point for you or your organization to thrive. So draw up your anchors and prepare for departure in this week's episode of Beyond the Breakwater.
Welcome back, everybody. We're just so glad you're here to join us for the podcast. And I'm here with Lyndsay. And Lyndsay, we've been having a really great time talking about these trends. And so we're going to do a little bit of a follow-up from last week. And we just wanted to bring all the listeners along that if you haven't already listened to last week's podcast, we want to encourage you to go back and look and listen because we talked about the 7 trends that Carey Nieuwhof and he had proposed. And I love looking at those. I think it's always really good for us to look at what the trends are coming up in the future. And now that we're in 2024, it's really great to see what's coming. Yeah. Sometimes a little scary, isn't it?
Yeah. It's because it's like these micro shifts that are happening that have like impact several years later. It's like you're making shifts in your church that you're not seeing what the exact like results will be. So, I mean, yeah, since our roles are reversed here and you did the intro, I'll just take over your typical line of, it's really fun being here today, Ed.
It is fun to be here.
But yeah, so like Ed said, we're talking about those 7 church trends. Last week, I'll just kind of talk about the ones that we did touch base on. I feel like when we recorded last week's episode, we were just going to do this as a one episode only, and just kind of generally group some of the trends together, talk about them, but we just got a lot of really great feedback from that, and so wanted to continue more specifically in the trends. So the ones we talked about last week, again, these are Carey Nieuwhof's. They're posted on his webpage. You can go and find them. They're in a document, and they also have like discussion questions at the end of the article too. So if you hear some papers shuffling around, that is me just kind of navigating through these. So the first one being that the stable church has become an endangered species. And that's kind of just talking about the church is either growing or it is declining. The stable church doesn't really exist, and you kind of have to make a shift, whether you're declining or growing, and analyzing like your strengths and what's going on. Last week, we also kind of grouped, like I said, some of these trends together. So this one being millennials are the new core of your church. And then we started to branch into Gen Z will start to reshape the church. So continuing from that conversation, let's kind of just talk about what the future church is. Ed, I kind of just want to pick your brain also about what you think is coming up, like if you're relating with some of these trends, if you're seeing them, maybe you have different predictions from Carey's. So we'll kind of jump into that. So because Gen Z and millennials, like that was a discussion that we had, like the oldest millennials are turning 43 in 2024, and the oldest Gen Z are turning 27. So it's like these are people that are very well integrated into the community. They're integrated into your churches. These aren't just kids that we're talking about anymore. So needing to incorporate them a lot more in decision making, in like giving them a place in the church to have some responsibility and have some ownership, and just to really start hearing like, what are these guys passionate? Where are they? Where are they serving? We talked about like the boomers no longer are in your churches. That was a big surprise that I think a lot of churches felt, is that the older generation, a lot of them did not return. And those that did return, that's kind of who's left in their church. And so because there's a large absence of young adults, Gen Z, millennials in the church, you're seeing a lot of decline. Like church attendance has gone down, I think, was it 8%? Maybe, I can't remember what that stat is, but over the years, that goes down every single year. And so, Ed, I think you had a brilliant point last week in talking about, as we're talking about this model of Beyond the Breakwater, like where are the young adults? Where are the younger folks? Why are they not in the church? And the things that they're caring about are the things that are real and authentic. And there is a distrust that the younger generation has in larger organizations and in the church. They were kind of born out of the era of production and the fog machines, the smoke, the lights, and the mass production of things, where it's like, I think they feel a little bit scarred from that, and they can see like straight through anything that is not real. And so there is this desire for the younger generation to have like a realness and a truth and an authenticity, and they want Jesus to impact, like if they are believers, they want Jesus to impact every single part of their life. Like they want the gospel to not just be a Sunday morning thing, but they want it to be applicable in the workplace, in how they spend their time, in their friend circles, and what they're doing as extracurricular or recreational activities. Like the Bible studies, that is still important to them. Like they want the word of God to impact their lives. Mm-hmm. And so those are just believers who are Gen Z. But I think like those who are not believers in Gen Z, like they still care. They want their lives to matter. They want to have purpose. I mean, you think about why people are jumping from like, you know, the older generation, they would maintain a career for like 40 years in the same job. And you look at the younger generation and you're seeing them jump from career to career to career within like a 2 year is like the average that the younger generation stays in a job. And I think the heart of that is like they want to find what they're passionate about. They want their work to be meaningful. But I think there's a lack of understanding that like that takes mastery. That takes sustained like work in the same direction to get to a point where you feel passionate about what you are working towards. But the misunderstanding in the younger generation is like, oh, I'm starting at the bottom, but I want my work to be up here and I want it to be meaningful. And so those who are not believers, it's like they have that desire still, and they want their dollars to matter. They want their time to matter. And so what they're spending their time in, what they're giving their dollars toward, are the things that have a direct like impact and purpose in the social justice arena. And so your point last week, you said like, where are the young adults? Like the young adults are all beyond the breakwater. And so if your church is still in the harbor and they're playing it safe and your boats are raised up out of the water, or practically speaking, your church is simply a club of a church for the churched, and you're not having those intersection points in your communities where there are unbelievers who are young and thriving there because that's what they're caring about, like you are missing out on a whole population that is like very passionate, and where that passion can be redirected and where the church can benefit from that passion. So that was a lot.
It is a lot. I've been thinking, okay, how am I going to respond, and which part of this are we going to respond to?
Where are you going to land the plane?
Let's go back in history. It's kind of fun. You know, I've been in ministry for over 30 years, and it's really fun, Lyndsay, because I get to kind of look back and say, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And it might help us for why we're where we're at right now, especially with the millennials and Gen Z. So if we go back, most churches 30 years ago were doing pretty much all traditional. We were in a country, I mean, we're still in a country, but I mean, in our country, for the most part, it was a Christian cultural country. Mm-hmm. That you didn't know who was a believer, you didn't know who was not a believer, because everybody kind of acted the same way. And so when the believers would be in church, it was really just an extension of what was going on around them in society. So the churches were caring about the same thing that the community was caring about. As time went on, it started to shift a little bit, and as the country started to shift and started to go a little bit more different direction, not necessarily the believers, the way that Christians are following a Judeo-Christian model, you started to now see a little bit of a change. Now, here's another huge change. There were some of the large churches that began doing some significant contemporary worship. And it was like, what? They're doing contemporary worship? And any church in any community that was doing contemporary Christian music well, and I'm just talking 25 years ago or maybe 30 years ago, got a tremendous following. So what happened was, whoa, what is that? And everybody was leaving their church and they were going over to a contemporary. So that was the newness. That was like the shiny, the new, the innovative, the creative. We don't have to do church the way that we've been doing. And now we're going after the unbeliever. We're going for seeker-sensitive churches, looking after those who don't yet know Christ. So living through that, what happened was now as more churches were like, whoa, that's really kind of a cool thing. We should do that too. And as that was coming up, now you had, now we got to have a better light show. So then some churches would have the better light show. Now you got to have a better production team. Now you got to have the fog machine. Now you got to have, so what happened was it was from the old style, a little bit more traditional style, to the new and fresh contemporary worship, to seeker sensitive. And if you're kind of tracking, it just keeps going further and nobody knows where to stop. You just keep going. So now when their kids are growing up, this is all they knew. And they're looking at it going, this is kind of empty. It's not empty for the boomers. And it might not be too empty for even the millennials, but mostly for the boomers and up. This was like spectacular. This was incredible. So I think even now, most boomers are like, we love all that stuff. It's really fun.
That's interesting because, like, I think with that change, my stereotype of what I think of like the older generation is that when there's a change, there's resistance. So I just wonder why there was such like receptivity to that. And I don't know if that is entirely accurate too, because I, like, growing up at the church that I was at, I remember when they made a shift to more like contemporary, and then there was a lot of complaint from the older generation. And so then they hosted like this, they had two types of worship services where they had actually a full band ensemble, and I would play with my family in it. And then the second service was the contemporary.
Yes.
So they were trying to balance and meet two styles and preferences.
So within that, let's really just run with that for a minute.
Okay.
You're right. And I think that's still today. I think you have some churches and older churches that are still very traditional and they really want that. But remember, when you don't have a choice and that's all you have, then there's a segment of that population that when contemporary worship came out, they were like, this is amazing. We love this. And there's the worship wars. You know, you have the traditional, you have the contemporary, and then the contemporary just kept going further and further, like we just talked about a few minutes ago. I still think you have that.
Okay.
So I think you have the traditional group. I think you have the people that are like, I'm not looking for traditional, but I love this now, what's going on in contemporary worship. Now you have a group coming behind. I think this is where the millennials and especially Gen Z are like, there's not a lot in this. There's not a lot of depth in this. I think they're looking for more. And interestingly enough, I think if you skip that era and go to the older generation, they had more. It was deeper. It was Christ. And they really had a great relationship and a deep love for Christ. And then I think in the contemporary, what happened is I think as churches began to try to reach into people's lives who didn't know Christ, you have to kind of like turn it down. And when you turn it down, it can feel empty. And I think if Gen Z is going to those churches and it's just like, this seems a little bit like not deep. It's not Christ in me. It's not Christ in every aspect of my life. Because that doesn't really appeal to the unbeliever to hear those messages. Yeah. So I think we're going through another shift.
Can you, real quick, before we talk about that other shift, like, I don't want to dismiss that middle group because I think that is a big portion of our listeners, and that might be something that they're hearing and saying, like, are you accusing me that I didn't have a depth of faith? Like, what was that born out of? Like, you were in the church at that point. Like, what was your perspective of what was happening then?
Yeah, I think that was, I can tell you as a preacher, during that 15-year era, it was, how do I speak the message about Christ for the unbeliever who's walking into the church? How do I bring them along So how do I speak into the lives of those who want to go deeper in their relationship with Christ? And yet, how do I also speak into the life of the person who's coming in for the first time? That hasn't changed. I mean, as I still preach and teach today, I'm always sensitive to the person walking in for the very first time. How do I speak into their life, but how do I speak into the depth of Christ in us and the life he wants us to live as a fully devoted follower of Christ? Boy, it's a hard line to walk. But I think going back to the trends, I think what we're looking at now is we're looking at a generation coming behind, and they're looking for the depth. They want the meaning. They don't want the fog machines. They don't want those things because it's like, that's not really helping me necessarily. How do we get back to Christ? And interestingly enough, I was meeting with a couple of young adults, and I just asked them, I said, so what do you think is going to happen in 25 or 30 years in the church? And they said, we're going to look for a traditional church because we want the meat. Because we know that we're going to get something solid for our faith. And that's what they're looking for. So I think if I go back to what I said originally, like if I'd put it on a scale, let's say you had because we were in this Christian culture, maybe a believer is at 55 and an unbeliever is at 45 because he's still acting so much like a believer in culture. What's happened is that we've gone from, say, a 45 to 55 to a 35, 55, 25, 55. See how the spread is getting bigger? So as the spread gets bigger, every church and every pastor now has to make a very conscious, deliberate choice. Who am I going to speak into the life of who? I can't speak to the one who's at 25 and at 55, not age, but where they are in their faith. I can't speak into both those lives in the same message. It's really hard because either I got to scale it this way for this person, seeker sensitive, or I got to scale it to go deeper. Because if you scale it this way, what happens is those who are strong in their faith are like, I'm out of here. I'm looking for more. But if you speak in such a way that you're not speaking to the people that are coming in for the first time, it's like, I have no idea what you're trying to say. I'm out of here. I don't understand it. So every pastor, I think this is what really, without saying it, this is what Carey's talking about. We're in this era of how do you speak into the lives of people? How do you do worship in such a way that it's meaningful? Meat.
Yeah.
The meat that Paul talks about, not milk, but meat. How do you do that? And I think we have a generation coming behind. I mean, your generation is just like hungering. That's exciting. Because just a little ahead of you, we didn't find that.
Yeah. It's for me like really encouraging to see that, and I like my heart has been in young adults and in high schoolers and wanting to like capture that passion and redirect it, because I think if you're not careful, like they might find it elsewhere, and like the church has something really special to offer. And so let's keep moving with the trends, because we do have like several that I do want to work through. So with the rising of like the next generation being in their, like the 20s and 30s and whatnot, there is this rise for like a digital component. So the trend being discipleship has a growing digital component. So are you seeing that play a factor in the church today? And where do you see that then in the future?
Yeah. Let's go back a few years. People used to expect pastors to be in their office for whenever they wanted to come into the office. And so pastors camped out in their office a lot, which I think is one of the reasons why churches are in trouble today, because they got used to the attractional model and they would be sitting in their church. And now it's rare that people come into the church and say, hey, is Ed around? Can I have a chat with Ed? And I'm usually not. I'm not in the church a lot. So everything has become almost digitized. We'd have to go mobile on everything. And so we've mobilized our staff. We're even looking for the future, like what's coming. We're putting more and more things online. We're putting things out there, knowing that people are looking at those things first. So what would a production studio look like, at the church? What's the staffing we have to do? And we're coming up to a decision point where we have somebody who's been running the front office for the last 15 years since I've been here. They're retiring. And now we're looking at the staff position to say, what would it look like if we put somebody different in that role that's much more digital? And what could that look like? So if they're not going to come in the doors, what does it look like for us? So we're wrestling with that, just like everybody else.
Do you think that we are using like the digital tools as a component for discipleship?
I think we're always developing those tools. Can we do more? Absolutely. I think there's a balance again, because I think what we're also watching, and this is going to be, I think, future trends coming down the path, that the more that we do digital, the less community that people are having. And we can have a whole discussion about the community online versus community in person. But I think we're approaching this really difficult place of, I mean, this is where AI comes in, and I know that's one of the trends too, that it's so easy for us to slide into digital AI, everything online, and then people don't even know how to talk to each other.
Right.
And they're hungering. We're watching, they're just, when we have things at church now, more and more people are coming. I mean, you're doing, what do you call it? Cardio drumming?
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
Talk about cardio drumming, and how many people are coming to cardio drumming from the community?
I mean, we're maxing out the space.
And what does that mean? How many? 5?
We've got like 30 on a given week.
Okay.
Sometimes
What's cardio
growing.
drumming?
So you have a 17-gallon bucket, and then you have an exercise ball sitting in this bucket, and you got drumsticks.
Okay.
And so it's a fitness class, and you do it to music, and it is super hype, because it's like, imagine you're in a small room, or a room that's accommodating to at least 40 people, and everyone has these drumsticks that you're just hearing this pounding to on like a bucket and a ball in a in sync way, in a choreographed way, and you're like, what is, like, the room is just like reverberating with this sound.
The whole church reverberates when you do it.
Yeah, actually, Mike, our garage manager, he was out in the garage, a completely separate building from the church, and the next day he was like, oh my goodness, I was sitting in my office in the church and I just heard the drums. And he was like, I thought there was a storm coming. I thought a car hit the building. I like ran outside and looked and just saw this mass of people like all rising and falling in squats in the same rhythm. And I was like, yeah, that would be a frightening sound. But it's cool because it's like the community is coming, and you're seeing both, I think, people in the church who have been going to the church for like 30 years, and you see them meet and they're like, oh yeah, I've been coming here for 20 years. Oh, I've been here for 30 years. Oh, nice to meet you. And it's like, how have you guys never met before after going to the same place for 30 years? And then it's like, just this past week, we had like 8 new people that came that were just teachers from the school down the road. They'd never been to the church before, but they heard about it. And like, what a cool interaction and intersection point, you know?
Well, we're highlighting what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because we could put you in this production studio all by yourself with and cardio drum, right?
Yikes.
I mean, couldn't we do that?
Yeah.
And then put it out there and then tell everybody, stay at home and grab your exercise ball, your 17-gallon bucket, your drumsticks, and we could do everything online. So I think this is what the hard part is, and I think this is where the trends are heading. Like, how do we do this in such a way? Like, people are looking for community, which is why you have 30-some people coming. You have all these teachers that are coming from the public school, and they want to be part of community, doing it together. Otherwise, you could do it in your basement all by yourself, and nobody knows what you're doing and seeing what you're doing. So, and you wouldn't have the sound going on.
Like the motivation, the person next to you that's like, this is hard.
Right. So see, I mean, even, you know, you like to go to the gym and I like to go to the gym, and everybody puts their headphones on and you're together, but there's not really a lot of community. You're doing your own thing. So I think we're struggling a little bit as a society. Like, should we maybe be, you know, videotaping or, you know have a camera on, you're streaming. Yeah, see, it's all old lingo. Should we be streaming what you're doing so the person can the person can be at home and doing it with you while you're actually doing it live in community. I think those are the wrestles that churches are facing. Like, how much do we do in
Right.
community? How much do we do online? And finding the balance.
Right. Because I mean, we've talked about too, like, okay, how much effort and money and time are we putting into streaming Sunday mornings?
Right.
Like, okay, yeah, we talk about this cardio drumming class, and like that, I think the same comparison can be drawn to Sunday morning, where it's like, okay, like, yes, we do stream our Sunday morning messages and worship, but we're not putting all of our effort into that, because it's like, that's a great tool for someone locally if they're traveling, or, you know, we have the people that are occasionally listening who don't live in Midland, Michigan. But there is something special about the local impact of a church. And if someone wanted to check into an online church, it's like we look at Life Church or Elevation Church, and they have massive production teams. They spend a lot of like time and energy and effort in their online ministries, where it's like, that's just really hard to compete with. And same for
we can't compete with it.
No. Yeah. And like cardio drumming, it's like, you know, I could do that, but to be honest, I got a lot of my stuff and like ideas from people that were also streaming cardio drumming. So it's like, I can just, rather than me spending all of my time there, I can direct people to that resource, and then I'm going to lead the in-person group stuff. So it's just a question of like, yeah, how do you balance that?
I think it is really hard. I mean, this is where we've talked in the past about you can't out-local the local church. So there's, again, I think the church is living in a tension, and I think it's really struggling because there's an online presence. People oftentimes will come to worship with us online before they ever set foot in the church. And then they want to see what the experience is sitting in the church and being with other believers and other people in the community. But I think there's also that component of the church doing local ministry. This is going back to our model. It's Beyond the Breakwater. So now the church is gathering, but the church is actually in local ministry. And you can't do our grocery store online.
Right.
I mean, we just can't do it. I mean, we could do online food like the others are doing, but we're in the people business. We're not in the food business. We're in the people business. And we're using food as the avenue to love people and care for people. And you can't do that digitally. You have to do that in person. So I think this is where the tension, and I think the trends are like we are going this way, but I can almost tell you that we're going to see, this would be my prediction, we're going to see everybody moving much more digitally. It's going to be at the cost of every community ministry. Now, the reason why we're doing this podcast is we want people to go into their communities. We want people to be in community ministry. And that's not digital. That's, I need to show up. I need to be present. I need to have a ministry of presence in the community, loving people according to needs. And there's nothing digital about it.
Right.
But there's the digital component of it. Like if you look on Facebook and you look up the bridge, you'll see Marcia and Joyce. They're making videos all the time for the community to come in and see what we have.
Yeah. Yep. I think that, that's the balance. And I think it'd be ignorant to say that like, oh, like in person is where it's at and let's disregard everything digital. But I think there comes a risk when you move everything digital. So with everything, there's a balance. And it's like, yes, I think the point of this trend being like, don't be blind to the digital shift that's happening, but use it in a way that maximizes your ministry. And I think how we've used that is, like you said, on Facebook, creating awareness, creating, showing what the personality is behind the bridge. And Marcia and Joyce, the managers there, like, it's like you jump on there and you immediately know, like, oh my gosh, they're so funny and so lighthearted. And it's just this draw that like you want to be there. Yeah. And I think the same can happen in discipleship too. I think that's the lens from which this trend is being talked about is like, what does it look like for the church? We're kind of just taking a spin on it in the context of our ministry being the community ministries. But it's like we've seen that in different resources that we can have. Like I'm leading a Bible study that uses video as like a lot of the content that is being like from a discussion base. So there's a lot of tools that are out there for even just like managing your people and your congregation and creating check-in points and church directories that are no longer, like the paper copies with everybody's family picture in them, but now you're on your phone in a church directory and you can look up families like within that setting.
Yeah.
So I think that is some of the shift that is being talked about in this.
I'd like to overlay the model because I think when we keep going back to Beyond the Breakwater, it helps me understand a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
We could fall into the same trap by being in the harbor and using GoFundMe as a way to make a difference in people's lives. That they're actually not going beyond the breakwater. Sitting in the harbor, doing nothing, on their phone, pick something, fund it, and look at the difference that we're making in someone's life, which
Mm-hmm.
is okay, that's a part of it. But then I think there's another part of this that what we really want to do is we want to get people to go beyond the breakwater.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a hard thing to do, is find that balance.
Yeah, exactly. So let's keep moving here. So the next trend is like kind of you hear it and you're like, what are you going to say? So he wrote that partisan extremism will continue to fuel short-term church growth. And the point that he's making with that is like, don't make the pulpit a political stand. That's the shift that we're seeing in. There are a lot of churches who will use the pulpit as a political stand, and it does drive, I think it drives both people away from the church, but there is also a response of driving people to that church.
Yeah.
And so it's only going to be short-term growth there. You're going for the quick win, but is it what is sustainable? And so his point is, like he said, he wrote a line in there that says, being courageous these days means becoming an alternative to the culture, not an echo of it. So Ed, with that trend, I really want to hear your take on like, where have you positioned Messiah and like your approach to politics in the church space?
Well, it's not always a popular place, but what I like to do is to stay neutral, as neutral as possible. There are times we're in Michigan, and there was even some bills that were coming along, and they were pro-abortion, and they were inviting all of the churches to take stands, to participate in this, to get petitions signed. And that would be a good example of, I had people that were coming into the church and accusing me of, you don't care about this because you're not participating in this petition signing. You're not speaking about this publicly, that this is what we should be doing from a political standpoint. And what nobody, I don't think, really appreciated is that my job as the preacher is to teach the Word of God. Mm-hmm. I have no idea what's going on in people's lives when they walk in the door. I know that statistically we had what we call Life Clinic, and that was a place where people could go who find themselves pregnant and need resources if they want to have the child and carry the child to term. We had them come to our church years ago and speak into the lives, especially of all the women, because they said statistically 1/3 of the church, the women sitting in our church, the adult women, have probably gone through an abortion. And so I'll never forget when she spoke into their lives, because what we want to do is we want to create a space where somebody who maybe has had an abortion can still hear about Christ and how much Christ loves them and forgives them, and not hear that abortion is okay, but to see what God has to say about it. And they're going to hear that, and it's going to hurt, but they're going to be in a place where they're loved. To have a booth with a petition to sign, I think could be, now it's not, it's an unsafe place for people. So we've always stayed in the middle, neutral.
Yeah.
Not meaning we're not taking a stand. We're going to stand with what Jesus said, and we're going to speak very clearly about what God says about any issue, about every issue. What does God say about it? And we try to leave all politics out of it so that people walk in, no matter where they are, no matter what their lifestyle is, no matter what they've done in their past, can they find a place where they're going to hear truth and grace? And I think that's really it.
Yeah. And I think listeners need to hear that, like not hearing us saying like, we're staying neutral equals silent.
No,
like that,
not at
that's
all.
not it. And so I don't want people to think that, because I think the combat to that would be like, okay, we are called as Christians to be like the salt and the light of the earth. We are
Yes,
called
to
to speak
speak.
truth. We are called to bring, like to be different and separate from the world, and like to take a stand and to be vocal at times.
Right.
And so like, I think maybe the difference in the shift is how that is applied, because like, I think, yes, all of that is true, but does that mean you are telling people, please vote this specific way? But I think what I've heard you say is no, like our job, it is to preach truth. Like we are preaching truth, and like we will say what the Bible says and how it is interpreted and applied. Like the Holy Spirit is responsible for that. Like our job is to inform people's hearts of what truth is.
Right. Well, and I can tell you specifically how Messiah in the past, why this has been a challenge for me, that I've had to just kind of walk carefully and honor God throughout all of it, is that we had, for the whole region, the Democratic chairperson going to our church. So every Democratic political agenda she had sitting in the pew. And then we had the Republican attorney general attending our church. And so when you have the Democratic chair and you have the attorney general who's Republican, and they're both sitting in the church on the same Sunday, in the same section, and they want to hear what God has to say. And I think that was probably the best training for me. Like, this is not going to be political anything. And we're going to honor people's position. So we congratulated the person for their position, both of them, when they got their positions. And we spoke the word of God. And I've done that for a decade, to speak into the lives of these two people. And so they were really good for me to say, how do I bring Christ without the politics? How do we speak truth and grace and accountability and discipleship into their lives without venturing into voting?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's good. That's exactly what Carey Nieuwhof is suggesting as well. So actually, Ed, I'm gonna put you on a spot to make a decision here. We're like at like 30 something minutes. You want to keep going because we have 2 trends left? Just extend this episode a few minutes extra.
What are the trends?
Okay, this next one is so number 6 is AI adoption will become normative in growing church cultures. And so what some of that is looking like is like the pieces it's saying that members are struggling with. Like we kind of use it as a tool for like the digital space. There's ChatGPT, which if you don't know what that is, it's like AI. You can ask it to write things for you. You can ask it anything. Like I use it every single day, and I feel like it's almost like a coworker of mine because it's like, all right, I'm writing the newsletter. And I can just dump my incoherent thoughts on it and be like, write a caption really quick about Journey's Coffee House hosting a trivia night and make it fun and lighthearted. And then bam, it creates it for you. And then I can at least use that as my template and make some shifts there. So it's helpful for idea generation and as a tool. But I think some of the risk that it poses and what Carey is suggesting is that the disruption that it has also on your church with members facing, he says members are struggling with potential job loss to AI, the emergence of AI relationships and AI porn, and the depersonalization that AI is ushering in. So Ed, could you speak to anything that you think would be valuable for listeners to kind of glean from this trend?
I think in the future, it's going to get harder and harder because with every good tool, we can always find a way to make it bad. I mean, the phone has been amazing for us, but I remember a long time ago when somebody used it and said, it's pocket porn for people. How do you take something that's so good and use it for so bad? AI, we use it for so many good things. Every time we do something, a search on Google, you know, that's AI. I mean, we're just benefiting from that. I mean, I barely type something in and it's already completing all the things for me, you know, that's an amazing thing. But I think it's also being used for bad. I think we got to get people back into the Word of God and use the Word of God solidly. Use your phone to get into the Word and use it regularly, because the more grounded we are in Scripture, the more that we're going to be able to walk through these things and deal with all the other things that are coming.
Yep. And I think the point would be the same. The application might be the same for the digital space. Like jump on it as a tool, but also have conversations, especially with like younger folks, about the dangers of that as well.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we are on the last trend, number 7. We talked about it a little bit last week, being that there is a new kind of megachurch pastor that will continue to emerge. And it kind of reflected on like some of that Gen Z and millennial lingo, being that like these guys, the pastors, being that they're less top down and they're more consensus based. I read these last week too, but just to kind of recap, they're not interested in popularity and platform. They're more involved in the local community and the ministry that's happening locally. They want to lead well within the context that they're in. They don't bring back the past, but they're more focused on building a future, and they are less fixated on size and more on health. Ed, is there anything that you want to say with this? I mean, your disclosure, turning 60. Sorry to
I'm
expose you, but like, what are you seeing with that?
I think it's how we ended the last podcast last week. Mm-hmm. The emerging pastor, the pastor that's coming up, they're more interested in things beyond the breakwater. They're not interested in things in a harbor. So they may appreciate the history or things that the church is offering, but they really want to go beyond the breakwater. So they're not as interested in stance or how big the church is or look at me in the harbor. I think if we would put their passion together to make a difference, mm-hmm. which is always going to be beyond the breakwater. And so I think as younger pastors are emerging, they're going to start beyond the breakwater, mm-hmm. and they're going to find the causes, and they're going to find the things that they're passionate about. And the more passionate that they are, they're going to find more people are coming out there and saying, how can we participate? How can we help you? How can we be out there? Mm-hmm. Isn't that the whole purpose of our podcast? We want people to get out there beyond the breakwater. Mm-hmm. And we are struggling getting pastors who have been in a harbor for any amount of time, and the deeper and longer they're in the harbor, getting them out of the harbor seems almost impossible for us. That's the struggle. That's why we're doing the podcast, to say there's another way, but they're having to change how they've done things for all these years and go out beyond the breakwater. Mm-hmm. Well, if you take a new leader, a younger leader who's already passionate about beyond the breakwater, they might need some coaching out there. Mm-hmm. Like, here's what we've learned beyond the breakwater, but they're already there. Mm-hmm. So I think everything about being beyond the breakwater is different. They're not trying to build a harbor church. Yeah. They just want to go make a difference.
Right. Yeah. So my last question before we kind of jump off here is, I think this might be a little bit of an easier trend to just look at and go, oh, interesting, cool. Like, what can the church's response be to that being an emerging leader coming up?
Well, I think listening to our podcast is going to be one of the biggest helps, because I think the deeper you go into what we've been talking about, mm-hmm. and encouraging them to go beyond the breakwater, and we've mentioned this before, that if the church doesn't want to go beyond the breakwater, then maybe they need to leave that church and go beyond the breakwater and find mm-hmm. a way to go. We've heard from people that have left the church mm-hmm. because the church refused to go beyond the breakwater, and now independently they're going beyond the breakwater. Embrace this generation. They are so passionate. Mm-hmm. Your generation, so passionate about making a difference in people's lives. Imagine if we can take the passion of the younger generation with the experience of the older generation and put those together, and voila, you got beyond the breakwater.
What a beautiful
That's
picture.
What we're doing.
Yeah. So what can listeners do before they go?
Go back and read these trends, pore over them, pray over them, and ask God what he wants you to do to take a first step to start moving beyond the breakwater.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Beyond the Breakwater, a podcast of Elevate Community Ministries. Don't let the conversation stop here. You can email us at hello@beyondthebreakwater.org. We would love to chat with you, answer questions, plan a visit, and help you take your next step. We'll see you next week.